Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. We talked about Florida State's offense a couple of days ago and, kind of how it was going to look different heading into 2024. I think you can have a very similar conversation with this Florida State defense heading into 2024 as well. A couple of you guys asking in the comment sections if we could kind of take a look at this Florida State defense. One, can't thank you guys enough for the support and listening and checking the boys out. But I think more importantly, it's a very similar conversation where, yes, you have to replace a lot of difference makers, a lot of NFL talent. Obviously, Braden Fisk and Jared Verse on the defensive line, but I think just as importantly, two linebackers that didn't get as much NFL draft buzz. But you talk about consistent linebackers in Kalen DeLoach and Tatum Bethune, guys that you just knew what they were going to bring every single Saturday. That certainly matters as well. And although Florida State has a lot of proven talent that is moving on to the NFL, there's a lot of different aspects around this Florida State defense that I think could be really good in 2024. Now, I think the conversation we have to start with, and kind of not to rehash the 2023 conversation, but it was something that really frustrated me was when Jordan Travis went down with the injury and we were talking about this Florida State team and should they go to the college football playoffs with the quarterback being injured. One of the most frustrating aspects of the conversation is it seemed like nobody wanted to talk about how good this Florida State defense was last year. I mean, you take a look at some of the numbers, a 48% completion percentage given up, number one in the country. Sacking the quarterback 9.3% of the time. That was number 6 in the country. This Florida State defense was one of the better defenses that we saw in the country last year, and I feel like not enough people are talking about it. Although this Florida State defense is going to look different, I think the strengths of this Florida State team might be in different spots. I think we're all pretty confident that this Florida State defense is going to be pretty good in 2024. Want to get into a couple of different conversations. Number one, where's Florida State going to be very good? Like, what do we know about Florida State? Because there are a couple things we know. And I think the second one is where are the question marks and what questions does Florida State need to answer to start out that 2024 season to kind of get that feeling of how good this Florida State defense can be. Really excited to get into it. Before we do it, as always, again, to the Florida State fans, been an absolute blast talking this program. The amount of support y'all continue to show, it means the absolute world. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. I'm going to take a look into that Florida State-Georgia Tech game. I'm doing my prep on Georgia Tech. I feel like I know pretty good enough about Florida State. Got to go back, watch a few Georgia Tech games, so we'll get that out later this week. And without further ado, let's get into this one. And let's start with the known commodity of this Florida State defense. That is an elite passing defense. An elite passing defense in two different scenarios. One, the secondary is going to be really good, right? A.Z. Thomas, Fentrell Cypress, probably the best cornerback duo that you see in the ACC, and quite frankly, one of the better cornerback duos that you see in the country. A.Z. Thomas, I think, is going to be a first-round NFL draft pick in a couple of months. I think that kid is special. And then you look at Fentrell Cypress, maybe a small drop-off from what he was at Virginia in 2022. He was still a very good cornerback in the ACC in 2023. And what you're kind of hearing out of fall camp is that Fentrell Cypress kind of getting back to that 2022 form. I mean, A.Z. Thomas and Fentrell Cypress, it doesn't get better than that at the boundary cornerback position. Then you look at Earl Little Jr. I've said this a couple of times this summer. The fact that Earl Little Jr. came in and just kind of squeezed out Greedy Vance, that tells us a little bit about how good Earl Little Jr. is going to be for Florida State. Because I always thought Greedy Vance Jr., he was a very good football player for Florida State over the last couple of years, especially in 2023. Didn't play a ton, but I thought he was a very good player. I was very confident that Greedy Vance would be a nickelback that you could trust for Florida State in the 2024 year. Earl Little Jr. comes in and makes him transfer to USC. I think that tells you how good Earl Little Jr. is going to be. I think the biggest development out of fall camp is that Sheen Brown is going to be an absolute guy for Florida State in the secondary. Every single time I kind of sit down to read the fall camp notes, Shaheem Brown's name comes up. And I think that's a huge storyline because we did have some question marks about, what that safety position might be. You have some guys that we're excited about, guys like Conrad Hussey. It sounds like Shaheem Brown is coming in and just kind of being the guy in that safety room as a redshirt junior. I think that's a really big storyline. Now, on top of that, we think this Florida State secondary is really good. It was really good last year. What makes this passing defense, quote unquote, elite is I think the pass rush is going to be really good as well. You look at Marvin Jones Jr. and Patrick Payton, but then you look at the depth at that edge rusher spot, and a guy like Sione Lalea. I think all three of those players can be all ACC conference kind of guys, especially Patrick Payton. We kind of know what he is. He's getting the most amount of buzz from kind of the national media. I think within the Florida State program, Marvin Jones Jr. is generating a lot of buzz from spring camp and fall camp. And then personally, going back and watching as much Oregon State as I've had, Sione Lalea, he's not necessarily the flashy edge rusher. Like Patrick Payton and Marvin Jones Jr., they're going to be a little bit more flashy in terms of the juice and athleticism and the ability to win with speed and length. Sione Lalea is just a Mack truck, and it's not always going to look sexy like it might with Patrick Payton. Sione Lalea is going to be a guy. I really do think, and he was a second-team All-Pac-12 guy last year. I think he can be an All-ACC caliber guy in 2024. So when you start coupling what I think can be a very good pass rush with a very, very good secondary, you're going to have a really, really good passing defense. It was really good last year. I expect it to be very good this year. Now, I think the big question mark is, how good is this Florida State team specifically against the run? There's a couple of questions we have there that make us ask that question. One, the depth on the inside of the defensive line, the linebacker play, and I would probably argue as well the difference makers on the inside of the defensive line as well, where you go back to 2023, going back and watching as much 2023 film as I have, Braden Fisk was an absolute freak show on the inside of the defensive line. And I think one of the questions is, can we get Darrell Jackson Jr. or Joshua Farmer to kind of step up and say, hey, we don't need you to be Braden Fisk, but can you be pretty dang close? I think that's a question that I think a lot of Florida State fans can be asking in the early 2024 season. The guy I'm looking at is Darrell Jackson Jr. I mean, 20 miles per hour on the GPS, 600-pound back squat, 400-pound bench. This kid, you just look at him. He's a first guy off the bus kind of guy. He's a guy that you'd want on your side of the fight if you were a guy to scrap in a bar. I look at Darrell Jackson Jr. and say, I think the sky's the limit for this kid on the inside of the defensive line. Can he be that good? That's the question mark. And then you look at Joshua Farmer. Joshua Farmer's fascinating because you saw him play some really solid football early on in 2023, probably tapered off that production and that kind of game-wrecking difference maker towards the end of 2023. Can we get that Joshua Farmer that we saw early in 2023 consistently throughout the 2024 season? Again, Darrell Jackson Jr., Joshua Farmer, that's a defensive line or interior defensive line that we feel very comfortable with. How good can they be? That's a question. I think secondly is the depth. Now, I think the depth is, I'm getting increasingly comfortable with Florida State on the inside of the defensive line. We kind of knew Grady Kelly was a depth addition. Like, we didn't think Grady Kelly, when he came from Colorado State, was going to start over Darrell Jackson or Joshua Farmer. He was brought in to give quality reps behind those two. So we kind of know what Grady Kelly is. What is exciting me the most, Daniel Lyons and KJ Sampson. It sounds like both of those young cats have kind of taken that. Are they going to start over Darrell Jackson Jr., Joshua Farmer? No, probably not. I almost think certainly not. That being said, if you can get good reps out of those guys for 20 to 25 snaps a game while Darrell Jackson Jr., Joshua Farmer are on the bench taking a breather, I think that's a massive storyline, because we went into fall camp and saying, hey, after Darrell Jackson and Joshua Farmer, is there going to be a significant drop-off in production and level of play on the inside of the defensive line? I think there's probably going to be a little drop-off, but I don't think it's going to be a significant drop-off where it hinders this Florida State defense. So I think that's a really bright spot that we're getting in fall camp. And I think lastly, the linebacker room. I think this is kind of why it comes down to, can Florida State be a little bit better against the run, where that was really the only metric last year that they weren't elite in, right? They gave up 4.2 yards per carry. That was number 60 in the country. And so it wasn't great. It certainly wasn't bad. It was average. But you look at the rest of this Florida State defense, when you're great at every other spot, you don't want to be average at one spot. The rushing defense was average. And so can we get these linebackers to step up a little bit? I think Cam Riley was a massive addition in the transfer portal. He was that veteran presence that we were kind of banging on the table for. He's played a ton of football at the SEC. I think physically much more gifted than a lot of people give him credit for him. He is long, he's fast, he can cover a lot of ground. We obviously know what we have with DJ Lundy, who's a hammer against the run. And I think Florida State's defense, specifically against the run, might get even better as DJ Lundy's on the field more, because I don't think there's many backers who are better stopping the run than DJ Lundy. Now, is he as good as some other linebackers in terms of space, dropping back in coverage? No, probably not, but he's very good on first and second down. And then you bring in Cam Riley. I think you're feeling good about the linebacker spot. You're hearing good things from guys like Blake Nicholson and Justin Cryer, who, I might just kind of raise my hand and say I might have missed on that. I kind of just wrote Blake Nicholson and Justin Cryer off after that spring game, or after the bowl game against Georgia, saying, hey, we got to go to the transfer portal and grab some linebackers. And Florida State did with Sean Murphy and Cam Riley, which I think makes sense, but maybe I was just too quick to say they're not going to be ready to play during their second year of college football. We see a lot of linebackers take that jump, so you might get some more production than I might have thought about Blake Nicholson and Justin Cryer. And I think the real – okay, so how does this Florida State defense look different? I think Florida State now knows that they have an elite secondary heading into the 2024 season. If you have boundary cornerbacks, I don't think that was a known commodity last year. I think Florida State was confident in the secondary. I don't think they knew it was going to be as good. I don't think anybody saw A.Z. Thomas playing the way he did in 2023. Now that Florida State's going into the 2023 season or 2024 season, with kind of known commodities at the boundary cornerback spot, does maybe Florida State feel a little bit more comfortable rotating safeties into the box where, hey, we don't have many question marks? I don't think there's many wide receivers in the ACC that can win one-on-one matchups with guys like Fentrell Cypress and A.Z. Thomas and Earl Little Jr. If we feel good about that, can we start rolling safeties into the box and maybe just put a little bit more bodies in the box to answer some of those question marks we have about the run defense? I think certainly that's a thing that Florida State is probably going to look at in the 2024 season. So when you have a strength like Florida State does in the secondary, I think you can start getting creative in terms of how you want to use your personnel and how you want to cater your defense. So if there's one reason I think it looks different, I think you might see a little bit more of an aggressive approach for Florida State putting bodies in the box. We'll close it there. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.